Hello and welcome to this introductory lecture about tantric spiritual practice and its relation to Hegel's philosophy, or Hegel's science of spirit in particular. This lecture is inspired by a reading of the Phenomenology of Spirit. I will introduce you to an upcoming paper that is soon to be published by Philosophy Portal as a collective book project. It will be an anthology that contains papers about the relevance of Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit in its different facets to the 21st century. Now, in this introductory lecture, I will introduce you to my speculations on Alexander Barth's claim that the Tantra of the future will be Hegelian. I've divided up this lecture in 5 parts. First of all, I'll start by explaining spiritual practice. Then I'll go into tantric spiritual practice and its practical dimensions. Thirdly, I'll shortly introduce you to Hegel's Science of Spirit. And then I'll go on to explaining a Hegelian Tantra and a tantric Hegel and what that could mean in the 21st century. And lastly, I will present the triad of the tantric spirit and shortly introduce you to the non-relation. Spiritual practice. So in the East, a distinction that has emerged within spiritual practice is the distinction between Sutra and Tantra. Now, Sutra is the basis of all spiritual practice and religion. It is a practice that is based on renouncing, and specifically renouncing the drives and desires. And by renouncing the drives and desires, one is prohibited to completely indulge in them. A practice that I've personally been working with is fasting, whereby one is obviously prohibited to eat food and thereby one denies oneself a part of oneself. And this this practice matures your relationship to food. It teaches you to not indulge and have a kind of animalistic relation to food, but you're actually learning to live with the lack in yourself, the lack of food or the lack of satisfaction. And I would say that Sutra is the reality principle that Freud writes about in his Civilization in its Discontents is some kind of proto-sutra. The reality principle is a principle that denies the enjoyment of the pleasure principle. And here on the left hand side you can see a Christian nun who is practicing celibacy, and this is a good example of Sutra. So on the right we have Tantra, and Tantra is based on transgression. Instead of renouncing the drives and abstaining and distancing oneself from their power, one uses them, and one ritualizes them in a tantric realm so that one can actually transform oneself and cultivate a different relationship to them. And in this tantric realm, where these drives or where the sexual energy is ritualized, this requires an amoral ethics. That means an ethics that is according to your own desire, an ethics that means that doesn't externally negate the force of your drives and desires, but an ethics that comes from within and from that very truth of the body. So instead of the reality principle, Tantra is not simply the pleasure principle for the pleasure principle's sake, but it is instead a conscious way to deal with pathos. Tantra says, sex is the deepest form of slavery and can be used as a vehicle to achieve the greatest freedom. Poison can be used as medicine. If something deepens by awareness, it is good. If it dissipates by awareness, it is bad. If something ceases to exist by awareness, it is sin. If it grows by awareness, it is virtue. Osho. So, sex is the deepest form of slavery, but, Tantra says, can be used as a vehicle to achieve the greatest freedom. And this is something where Tantra goes beyond sutric practices like celibacy, asceticism, and the like. And the TNT, or the New Tantra, is a Tantra school based here in the Netherlands that basically makes use of Osho's claim that sex is the deepest form of slavery and can be used to achieve the greatest freedom. Now, why is sex the deepest form of slavery? Well, obviously, the sexual energy is a very strong energy, which is why many people claim that it is the life force itself. And in a more practical sense, sex is used by people to inflate their ego. People are very needy for sex. They're very greedy can be very greedy in the sexual space. One can have a lot of shame about their sexuality. One can feel a lot of guilt for acting out on it. People can disrespect others by means of sexuality, manipulate others to get sex. People can have massive pathological jealousy that decreases their awareness as spiritual beings. Now, the New Tantra school claims that it is neither traditional Tantra nor Neo-Tantra. And traditional Tantra is Tantra from ancient Eastern religions, so that means Tantric Hinduism, Tantric Buddhism, Dzogchen Buddhism, for example, Taoism. There are many traditions. And Neo-Tantra is something that has emerged in the 20th century with figures like Osho and the New Age movement. So the New Tantra claims that it takes lessons from both traditional and Neo-Tantra and also takes modern scientific insights and psychoanalytical understandings and philosophy to create a Tantra proper for the 21st century. And there is no Tantra without Sutra. So it is not like Tantra rejects Sutra and that one sides with Tantra against Sutra, but Sutra is in fact a very important way one learns to live in relationship to their leg. That means that the TNT itself recommends you to have some kind of therapy, perhaps a practice of silent meditation or fasting, or some kind of practice of embodied self-inquiry. Because Tantra is transformative spirituality, and the tantric realm that is facilitated by the TNT workshop can be a very demanding and intense realm that if one is not in touch with oneself, or for different reasons can actually be detrimental to one's spiritual becoming. So the New Tantra starts with sexual maturation. And sexual maturation is where one works, is where the workshop levels 1, 2, and 3 are for. So level 1 is about dealing with all of those negative phenomena I just mentioned, and it is learning about the most basic levels, such as having no goal in sex, such as serving the other person instead of having this neediness. It is emphasizing communication, boundaries, and empathy. Now, this is not a level that is explicitly sexual, People do not get naked in this level. And that's where level 2 comes in. So after you've done level 1, you can do level 2. And in level 2, like I said here, the clothes come off and one works with body de-armoring. So in the workshop, you work with the physical contractions that are stored in the muscles of the vagina and the cervix and the anus. And the de-armoring releases tensions and restores a sensibility to a natural state, giving you full access to your pleasure and opening up the body for new kinds of orgasms and deeper sexual experiences. Body armoring is a pervasive phenomenon here in this society. It can have different causes. It could be a trauma. It could be continuous conditioning by family, parents, friends, and society at large that results, one, in having shame about their bodies, like their anus, or the anus for men is a big thing that comes up. And the armoring is a contraction of the muscles. Women as a whole, many women deal with pain during sex, and this is because of the body armoring. So this is not something natural. This is actually something one can work with and solve, which is what level 2 is also about. There's also many different exercises, and level 1 and 2 together take 6 days and are done in a meditation retreat somewhere in nature. And level 3 is about sexual completion. So this is the level where one is motivated to live out their deepest, perhaps darkest sexual fantasies. Now, I've only done level 2, so I cannot talk about that at length. Level 4 and 5 are not sexual at all. So once you get the pathologies and the immature sexuality mostly out of the way, one can work with level 4, which is about transmission or devotion, and this is about submitting to a higher power, God, spirit, whatever provides meaning to you, and really going beyond individualism and committing yourself to work for that higher goal, which could also be your friends and family around you or the community at large. Level 5 is the ego workshop, and here one works with taking constructive critique and giving it, and that's the new Tantra. In Sutra, the path of renunciation, the emphasis is on giving up or renouncing negative actions and adopting positive actions, while Tantra seeks to purify or transform the negative tendencies of the body, energy, and mind into positive ones. This is a quote by Chogyal Namkhai Norbu. He's a Dzogchen master. And here again, we see that Sutra renounces, and Tantra actually doesn't merely negate, but uses the energy to transform. Spirit is this power not as something positive, which closes its eyes to the negative, as when we say of something that it is nothing or is false, and then, having done with it, turn away and pass on to something else. On the contrary, spirit is this power only by looking the negative in the face, tarrying with it. This tarrying with the negative is the magical power that converts it into being. Tantric Hegel. And I think these two quotes really link up very nicely because the negativity that is perceived by Sutra and Tantra are dealt with in different ways. The negative and being are mediated in different ways by Sutric spiritual practice and Tantric spiritual practice, where the supposedly the perceived and supposedly negative of the body the pathologies, actually, if one tarries with that, then one can unleash the magical power of spirit that converts it into being. Now, I will go into the science of spirit and firstly explain this ominous term called spirit. And if one could give a definition to this word spirit, then it is the process of its own self-becoming. That's what spirit is for Hegel. And in this process, it is self-othering itself, which means it is turning itself into an object and then taking back this object into itself as itself. And in this process of its self-becoming, it is moving to absolute knowing, which is the last chapter of the phenomenology of spirit. And absolute knowing is akin to spirit knowing itself as spirit, or perhaps we could loosely call it spiritual self-knowing. And throughout the shapes of consciousness and of spirit in the phenomenology of spirit, consciousness, self-consciousness, reason, spirit, and religion, spirit changes all the time and becomes different to itself. But in this different, it stays self-same. And in all these disruptions between the stages, its movement is restless. Spirit never becomes an inertia that stays where it's at. It is always self-othering itself towards the point of absolute knowing or spiritual self-knowing. So the science of spirit is something that Hegel provides us the coming to be of in the phenomenology of spirit. Hegel explicitly says that the phenomenology of spirit is not a foundation of science, or it's not like any substantial ground of science. And the content of the science of spirit is the experience of consciousness, which means that this is a science and a discipline one lives in, and not some kind of indifferent, neutral, objective science in the modern sense that merely analyzes and changes material substance outside of it. And I think this science of spirit and its theory gives us a methodological spirituality that is useful for spiritual practice as a whole, with its telos as self-knowing spirit or spiritual self-knowing. So I situate spiritual practice within the science of spirit as a scientific pursuit that experiments with the self as the totality of the sexual body-mind. Which means I have to relinquish the taboo on sexuality in pursuing scientific spirituality. Pure self-recognition in absolute otherness. This aether as such is the ground and soil of science or knowledge in general. This simple being in its existential form is the soil of science. It is thinking which has its being in spirit alone. Science, on its part, requires that self-consciousness should have raised itself into this aether in order to be able to live with science and in science. So there's two majorly crucial points that Hegel makes here, and that is that there is in fact a ground to science, and this ground is the pure self-recognition in absolute otherness. And to apply this ground in one's spiritual becoming is what I would argue to live with science and in science. Which brings us to Hegelian Tantra. Now, what happens in the tantric realm from a Hegelian perspective? Having gone through it, I argue that I hypothesize and speculate that the tantric realm facilitated by the TNT workshop could potentially function as a catalyst for the sublation of spiritual shapes that one inhabits, since one can unleash the power of spirit that is this magical power I already talked about that converts negative into being. And it is this moment of the unleashing of spirit's power that I call the self-encounter, which is the self encountering itself as the negative, or one encountering one's limit. And it is by going through the self-encounter that I argue that one can negate their abstract, universal, egoic patterns, their abstract, universal fantasies about sex, and the way it is contained in a tantric setting, and raise to a higher concrete universality in an embodied way, which means in the sexual relational real itself. So on the one hand side we have the body, we have tantra, and we have pathos. On the right hand side we have mind, philosophy, and logos. Now, spiritual practice or Hegelian Tantra is this practical side, and the speculative thinking of Tantric Hegel is the theoretical side. And the new Tantra has a slogan, and it makes sense in a weird way, Tantric spiritual practice. And I would argue that we could translate this, it makes sense in a weird way, to the new Tantra deals with pathos in a logical way. Since we are just thrown into this world, we are assumed to deal with sexuality in a very loose way. Since there's this taboo of the body, we don't learn about it anywhere, and a container that TNT provides actually is logically dealing with all the pathic energies. Now, on the right hand side, I claim that Hegel, in the phenomenology of spirit and his dialectical method, is a pathical logos. Hegel, as a philosophical thinker, utilizes pathos as negative disruptions to logos within logos itself. He's not indifferent to negation. He doesn't distance himself from negation that disrupt the formal logic, the formal Aristotelian logic of A equals A, but he incorporates pathos within his logos. So I claim that by having this logical pathos and this pathical logos, we can bring the body and mind closer together in the subject's oscillation and life, which is the soul. And it is this middle term, the soul, the spirit, or the mythos as the coming together of pathos and logos, that is an everlasting oscillation in one's life. It is not a final reconciliation, and pathos and logos will never end up in a complete peaceful reconciliation, but one can intensify their oscillation by tantric spiritual practice and philosophy and science of spirit in particular, to deepen embodied knowing of concrete actuality, which is, I would say, an observant presence that is embodied. Now this is a triad we can make that might be useful for tantric spiritual practice as a scientific pursuit. On the top we have Hegel, which provides us with the coming to be of the science of spirit in his book The Phenomenology of Spirit. And Alenka Zupancic, in her book What is Sex, utilizes the dialectical method and also Lacanian psychoanalysis to claim that there is a non-relation, or that sex is a determinate negation, that is a fundamental negativity, and secondarily manifests as an illusory fantasy of a final reconciliation in the relation. And thirdly, we have Alexa Vartman here, the founder of the New Tantra, with her highly practical and a very good book, 50 Misconceptions of Sex. Also, since she's the founder, she kind of personifies the TNT and the facilitating of their workshops, since she has developed the exercises and the workshops. And by taking this practical side of tantric spiritual practice, we can come back to the science of spirit with a deeper embodiment and deeper embodied self-knowing that then in turn can be used for deeper spiritual self-knowing on a theoretical side. And this tension that before I showed you with logos and pathos stays there, but deepens the revelations of the depth of spirit. Now, what is this non-relation exactly, and why is there one? So, as Lacan points at right here, the non-relation is that which brings the masculine and feminine together. The masculine and feminine here aren't biological essences. They are performative ways of relating. And this and the myth of the relation is what draws them to come together. It is a romantic dreaming about a final reconciliation that would dissipate non-understanding, would perhaps dissipate loneliness, and perhaps satisfy one's lack. And this myth of the relation through time is inevitably negated by the real of the non-relation. And the real of the non-relation could be the moment of breakup, could be the moment of a fight. It is the moment of a non-understanding where it is clear that the masculine and feminine do not in fact meet in a relation, but are attracted by this tension that can never be resolved by the final relation. So the third moment, AB, is there is a non-relation. And this is the way I conceptualize the final reconciliation of logical moment A and logical moment B. And to say that there is a relation is to see this absence or fundamental negativity of the non-relation as primary and as structuring the myth of the relation and the way the masculine and feminine meet and don't meet in their asymmetrical mediating. So this oscillation A-B is the final reconciliation in some sense. And Alenka Zupancic argues that sex is a persistent contradiction of reality, where there's this fantasy of harmonious merging, where the two, the masculine and feminine, merge into one. And this myth of the relationship, even though I've put it here first as logical side A, is secondary and masks the primary negativity of the real of the non-relation, or logical side B. The evanescent itself must be regarded as essential, not as something fixed, cut off from the true, and left lying who knows where outside it, any more than the true is to be regarded as something on the other side, positive and dead. Appearance is the rising and passing away that does not itself arise and pass away, but is in itself, and constitutes the actuality and the movement of the life of truth. So appearance is this rising and passing away that does not itself arise and pass away, but is in itself. So obviously Immanuel Kant put the phenomenal world on one side and the noumenal world on the other side, where the two will never meet. Hegel directly equates appearance, or the phenomenal with the noumenal, since the arising and passing and the evanescent and that which comes up is in itself. And there's nothing outside of this, since this is actuality, and this is the movement of the life of truth. So there is a non-relation. There is an in itself which arises and passes away, but this itself does not arise and pass away. The oscillation of A and B is all there is. And this is not a pessimistic note. This means that this absence and this knowledge actually demystifies sex as a persistent contradiction of reality that could help one to mature and relate to sexuality and the sexual non-relationship on a higher order. And this absence itself actually enables affirmative creation, and one can go to the core of one's fundamental negativity by means of sexuality. And this is what tantric spiritual practice is for. It is about the oscillation of A and B in experience, which allows for the self-supersession to the standpoints of spirit's self-knowing. And it is this spiritual practice, this cultivation of this experience that enriches oneself. Now I want to thank you all for watching, and this was merely an introductory lecture. Soon a paper that will go deeper into all of these topics will be published by Cadell Last and Philosophy Portal Books. The title is Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, Phenomenology of Spirit, an Anthology exploring the 21st century as the Hegelian century. Like I've already kind of pointed at, Hegelian Tantra for me is a Tantra for the 21st century, and I think the TNT Tantra school here in the Netherlands really does a good job of providing a basis for Hegelian tantric spiritual practice. So thank you all for watching, and see you in the next video.